Hi there, this is Seth Abramovich, senior writer at The Hollywood Reporter, and this is another episode of It Happened in Hollywood. This week, we have the groundbreaking literary series that influenced everything from Knives Out to Bandersnatch, that interactive episode of Black Mirror. All that and more on this week's It Happened in Hollywood. Okay, you're seated, you have your headphones on, you're ready to listen to another episode of It Happened in Hollywood. Do you want to stay there and just keep listening to the episode? Or do you want to answer that door? You choose to answer the door. Oh, there's a lion there. He just ate you. You're dead. All right, if you're confused, don't be. What I'm doing is laying out the basic gameplay of the Choose Your Own Adventure book series. This was a series that really entranced me as a kid. Is it literary greatness? Probably not, but it was definitely enough to keep me preoccupied for hours at a time. Each volume in the series would set you in a different milieu, kind of like a video game. So there was I remember one called Deadwood City, so you're in a cowboy, Old West situation. There was one called Who Killed Harlow Thrombey, and that was a very Agatha Christie type mystery set at an old mansion. And then the first one was called The Cave of Time, and that one, you went into a cave on a hike, and it spit you out into all different eras. Anyway, these books were all created by a guy named Edward Packard. Edward is 91 years old, and he's still very spry, very bright, and very much with us. And I reached out to him. It was basically like reaching out to God. This guy, the name Edward Packard, to me as a kid, I could never in my wildest dreams imagine actually meeting and asking him all the questions I had about his creation. But he reached out back to me and said he'd love to. So if you don't mind, this week we're going to take a little bit of a side trip away from film and TV into the world of Choose Your Own Adventure. And I think if you're interested at all in video games, in interactive storytelling, I think you'll really get a kick out of it. Clearly, the makers of Black Mirror got a kick out of it enough to create an episode that has basically the same structure. You're given branches and you choose which way to go. And they ended up suing the makers of Choose Your Own Adventure. Edward was not part of the company at that point, so he is not involved in that lawsuit, but I thought that was an interesting little tidbit. Anyway, without further ado, here is Edward Packard, and we're going to talk all things Choose Your Own Adventure. Edward Packard, thank you for joining us on It Happened in Hollywood.
Delighted to be here.
Now, typically on the show, we have film directors, actors, screenwriters. We're going to try something a little different this week, but I feel that your contribution to the cultural landscape and to storytelling is as major as any of these other guests that we've had. So, if the audience is not familiar with Choose Your Own Adventure, it is a series of interactive books that even predates video game storytelling that completely captivated me in my youth and has had ripple effects across all of culture. And you, Mr. Packer, are the name on the cover of these books that so thrilled me as a child. And it's almost like I'm talking to God or something, but here you are right in front of me. So thank you. Thank you for joining me and making my childhood dreams come true.
Well, thank you. Of course, just for those who aren't aware of it, it should be clarified that this was a series. It had precursors, but anyway, the main series was produced by Bantam Books, and it started about 1979, and they threw all their weight behind it, and for quite a while, some years we were putting out one book a month, and as a result, there were good many writers who were involved in it, and I wrote most of, for instance, there was another guy. Well, it's such a complicated story. It's hard to distill it into a few words, but I couldn't place my book to begin with an established publisher and place it with a small press. And the fellow who was the co-owner of that, named Ray Montgomery, and I ended up getting a contract with Bantam. And as I said, for a while, they put out one book a month, so that Bantam assigned 6 books to each of us for several years during the heyday of this series. And I provided 6, and Ray provided 6. But 6 were too many books to write of decent quality in 1 year, so we each hired subcontractor writers to write some of the books. So although Ray and I each wrote more in the series than anyone else, there were a number of other writers involved. And so that's how that worked.
So let's go back to the beginnings of Choose Your Own Adventure. Now, you were telling me earlier that you started not as a writer or a creative at all. You were a lawyer working in the music industry.
Well, yeah, I was a lawyer where I had a number of jobs during my legal career. I graduated from law school in 1959, so it wasn't until really about then I wrote the first of these books in 1969, but I couldn't get it published. So I continued on as a lawyer, and I didn't quit practicing law till about 1978 or in around there.
Which record company did you work for?
Well, I started out at a big Wall Street law firm, which got me very depressed. And then I worked for a small suburban law firm. And then I worked for RCA Records as a house counsel. RCA Records was a much bigger factor in those days, although it was a little bit eclipsed by Columbia Records, who had a much stronger repertoire in pop and rock.
And where were you living at the time?
I was living in Greenwich, Connecticut, and at that time I was commuting in on the train to New York every day, and which was part of the story because it was I thought up the idea for the Choose Your Own Adventure with my first book, which was titled Sugar Cane Island, by telling bedtime stories to my kids, and then I started writing up the story, riding the train in to New York and back.
Amazing. So you were doing this, white collar job and being frustrated and bored, and you had these ambitions to be a writer, so tell me a bit more about how you formulated the idea for the Choose Your Own Adventure through the storytelling to your daughter.
Well, like some parents, I was making up stories for kids to tell them bedtime stories, and I had my 2 older kids were girls, and I thought of a story about a kid named Pete, and Pete gets shipwrecked on a remote island, a little bit of a takeoff on Robinson Crusoe, that kind of thing. And I actually, as I'm sure is really the case, if I'd been a better storyteller, I would have just told them a great story and good night, kids. And but I got stuck, like many storytellers, what comes next. And so I got asking them, well, what should Pete do next? And then they had different ideas. So that's how I thought of the idea that suppose instead of Pete being the character, it's you, and you have to decide what to do next.
So the idea of setting them in the second person came very right at the beginning.
It came naturally because I was saying, what would you do if you were Pete? Would you walk along the beach and look for something along the beach, or climb up the rocky hill? And that was the first choice.
Now, I remember as a kid, there was a guide to how I could write my own. And it seems like there's a real mathematics to it. Or how did you figure out the map
I don't know if you'd call it mathematics. It's like a computer flow chart, I guess. I'd make a chart that looked like a tree lying on its side, and the trunk of the tree at the bottom would be the opening, and then there'd be the story begins, and then remember this tree is lying on its side, and then above a branch I'd write what a choice would be, and below the branch I would write what would happen, just the key words. And so when I did that and had my whole tree lying on its side with all these different branches and different choices and different things that happened after you made the choice, then I have an outline for the book. If you don't do something like that, you get very confused trying to write one of these books.
And so Sugarcane Island, so you finished it, and what happened to it?
Well, at RCA Records, I knew a guy. I had a fellow I worked with a little bit. He had a good friend who was a literary agent, William Morris Agency, and he said you ought to show it to Don at this guy. So Don, I did, and Don. It was Don Gold at the time, as his name was, and he liked it a lot. And he said, "I think I can sell this to a publisher." And so he sent it around to the big publishers, and they all said, "Oh, this won't do at all. This is too weird." Some said it's too much like a game, and not a real book. And I thought this is not a very enlarged view of what publishing could be, because it's really, if it can be put in book form and put in a bookstore and sell copies, don't you get it? That's the business you're in, not worrying whether it's in the right category. But anyway, they didn't think that way. And one guy said he thought it's hard to get kids to read these days, and you're just making it harder, making them having to make choices. And he didn't understand the principles of psychology or motivation and so forth. So anyway, strange enough, Don finally said, he said, "I'm really surprised I can't get anybody to publish it." So I got discouraged. I put it in a desk drawer. And then it wasn't until several years later, this was 1969, it wasn't until about 1976, that I was skiing in Vermont for a little quickie vacation, and saw at the place, they didn't call them Airbnbs then, they called them, I guess, just
bed and breakfast.
It was like somebody's home with a couple of, and they could accommodate several guests, and they had in the living room. I found a copy of Vermont Life magazine, and it said small. It was a story in it about a small press that was looking for innovative children's books, they said. So I thought, well, mine's innovative. So it was sitting in the desk drawer. So I sent it to them. And that's how it got started with this small press. But although the small press got off to a good start for them, they simply didn't have the distribution clout to really bring into being a series that could take off. So there are a lot of complexities, but that's how the very beginning was, and how and then eventually got to Bantam, which really saw the potential for it. And at that time, by the way, nearly all children's books were hardcover. It was just thought that that's the way you do children's book, and the paperbacks were much less prominent in the market than they became later. I remember in college, I seeing that. I think it was while I was in college, I saw these books from France, and they were in paperback. And I remember being surprised, saying, "Yeah, that's a good idea, this paperback business." Anyway, Bantam not only wanted to bring it out in paperback, but in mass market paperback, where they could go in racks in bookstores and at a lower price, and they could be featured in a way that rather than just tucked back in the children's book section in a bookcase. And that had a huge impact.
So I have a couple questions. First of all, Choose Your Own Adventure. Was that your name for them?
No, when I first wrote Sugarcane Island, I titled it "The Adventures of You on Sugarcane Island." But Vermont Crossroads Press, the small press, they said, that's a little bulky. Why not just call it Sugarcane Island? So I said, all right. And then after that got published, and they were very pleased with it and got off to a good start. And they got some good endorsements from kids in the local school. But I had the feeling that they really couldn't market this thing the way it needed to be. And they kind of sensed that themselves. So about this time, maybe about a year or two after Sugarcane Island, about a year after Sugarcane Island got published, I had a friend. So much of this works because you have a friend who has a friend.
Right.
I had a friend who had a friend who was worked for Lippincott, which was then a well-established publisher. They were later bought by Harper and Row. The mergers in the publishing industry, just been unbelievable. But so Lippincott met an editor there, and they published two of my books. The next two books I wrote, which was a Western called Deadwood City, and then
I remember it well.
A space one called Third Planet from Altair. And
Right.
They put the legend. They thought up the legend, Choose Your Own Adventure. So they put it on the cover of Deadwood City, the first book. Choose Your Own Adventures, they used the plural, in the Wild West. And then for Third Planet of Altair, they said, Choose Your Own Adventures in Outer Space. Well, then they asked for a third book, and I gave him a third book that was about you just won New York, which you won in a contest. You won New York. You won a free weekend, and you could spend as much as you wanted to do. You go to a Yankees game, go to a Broadway musical, take the circle around. You could do all kinds of things, and all kinds of things would happen to you in the book. So I thought it was pretty good. But they said, most kids throughout the country aren't that interested in New York City. You got to think of something else. Meanwhile, Ray Montgomery, the small press guy, through a complicated series of events, got an agent who was had a good relationship with an editor at Bantam named Joelle Del Borgo, and Ray presented a book, Journey Under the Sea, to Amy, and Amy presented to Joelle, and Joelle said this could be a really great series. And apparently not apparently, it's actually been written up and I've talked to Joelle many times. She prevailed upon Oscar Distel, who was the president of Bantam, and Bantam was a paperback powerhouse at the time, to really go all out on the series. So they decided they'd put out 6 books right away, launch it with a big splash, and send copies to teachers and people, and books, really go at it. And so it turned out that Joelle wanted me in on it because I was the started it all and was already doing my books with Lippincott, and Ray was the one who made the contact with Bantam through the agent Amy Burkauer at Writer's House, who was a friend of Joelle's and had a good relationship with her. So anyway, we all got together on the same page for a while. So Bantam, of course, looked at my books. They said, Choose Your Own Adventures. That's a pretty good idea. And the Lippincott was asleep on the switch, and is that the right phrase? At the switch. and they hadn't thought of trademarking it, and I was asleep at the switch because I hadn't thought of trademarking it. And so Bantam just slapped it on, registered it, and off to the races. And that's where Choose Your Own Adventure came from. It was really invented by somebody in the marketing department of Lippincott who probably said, "No, why didn't I get some credit for that?"
Some aggrieved marketing person wondering where their cut is.
Yeah.
And you seem to have not mentioned the Cave of Time, but to me that was the first one, the Cave of Time. So where did that fit in?
Yeah, well, in the first contract with Bantam, I had to write. I had 6 books were to be in that, and that was before we got 1 book a month. So we were doing 12 per year. But the first contract was just for 6 books, and I had to supply 3. So I thought, sort of time travel. This is a good idea. But my daughter Andrea said. She'd gone and she'd been at camp and gone into a cave in Vermont and exploring this cave, and she was thinking of a cave, and she said, "Why not a cave of time where you have different tunnels that go off, but instead of going to some remote part of the cave, they come out into the open, but it's not in the same place anymore. It's not in the same time anymore. You're in a different time." And so I thought this is more interesting and fresh than a time machine, the original concept of H.G. Wells. And so that's how we got that going, the Cave of Time being the vehicle for time travel stories.
Now, one of the things that kind of struck me as a kid was that you didn't pull punches. If you made the wrong choice, you were dead. and in very creative ways. Yeah. And it was there was something fundamentally kind of terrifying but exciting about the idea that at any turn of a page you could die. Were you at all concerned that you might be scarring young children?
Well, I felt that these kids were, it was still designed for 8 to 12 years old kids. And later, Bantam and we brought out a series for younger kids, really little kids, called the Skylark series. And that was for like 1st, 2nd, and 3rd grade. And the basic series is for 4th, 5th, and 6th. We felt by that age, and at the beginning, when I first booked Sugar Cane Island, I thought, well, if you do it the right way, it's kind of can be fun. So, for instance, I think my very first choice, not the first choice, but one of the first choices in Sugar Cane Island was where you get caught in quicksand, and you have to figure out what to do, because you're going to begin sinking. And as you probably know, just in case you're ever caught in quicksand, you got to roll over and roll out of the place as if you were in the water, because if you're standing up and struggling, you'll sink down. But if your weight is distributed, then you can roll out of it. So I had read that.
That's good to know. Thank you.
Yeah, you never know. So I thought this is a good choice. But in the case where you fail to do the right thing, the ending was, but you're going down, and then it says glug glug glug. So it's a humorous touch in it, and often it was that way. And it turned out the kids loved to die in this way, because they knew they weren't really doing it. As a matter of fact, I think I was influenced by, there was a psychiatrist named Bruno Bettelheim who wrote a book about children's literature and why do kids love this scary stuff. Some of the scary things that happen, he said it's because they can come to grips with that kind of thing without being terrified, because they understand that helps them separate fantasy from reality and so forth. And there was some of that to it. a lot of it has to do with the tone. For instance, you could describe dying in quicksand in a way that would be terrifying to a child, but if you say glug, 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 then it kind of is acceptable.
Just an interesting aside is that Bruno Bettelheim book inspired Into the Woods, the musical, which is also a very dark children's story with a lot of death in it. So there is something to that there is an appetite for the macabre amongst youngsters, not just adults. Now, another question I have about your storytelling is, well, I mean, what did it teach you about psychology? And I know not all the choices provided were just, choose path A or B, but were actual moral quandaries that you were presenting to children.
Yeah, I tried to have all kinds of situations. Some choices where, for instance, knowledge of or your instinctive sense would be what would guide you to a better choice. But occasionally we'd have choices where there was kind of a moral thing, and I made it a rule. I made it a rule that I assumed that the reader was a good person, a decent person, and so the person might make stupid choices, of course, or might make choices which are kind of selfish and not really thoughtful of others, but they never make a cruel choice, a choice to be cruel or to be criminal. So there were some moral situations where there were moral ambiguity, whether you're going to help somebody out, even though it's putting yourself at considerable risk. And, there were situations where a philosopher or a psychologist or an ethicist could make something of it, but these are rather simplified versions. But that kind of having some situations like that, I think, made the books richer than they would have been if they were just strictly analytical situations where you just weigh this pro and this con. I also should say, by the way, that I thought that the books should be kind of like life. And in life, you try to make it lifelike. And in life, there may be a better choice, a choice that's clearly better, but it doesn't always work out. There's a lot of probabilities involved. So irony is at work in life. And so I try to have some situations where, you made the wrong choice, but things worked out after all, or you made the right choice, but it didn't work out. To try to reflect the actual situation in life.
Exactly. Yeah. You could choose the altruistic choice, but then you end up getting shot in the foot, life is too often like that, isn't it?
Yeah. Try to have it rewarded enough so that you think it's a good general policy to be decent.
That's what's part of what made them so successful, is that you did not talk down to kids. This was not a Sunday school lesson you were trying to provide. You were trying to provide real entertainment.
I went around to schools and talked at schools and so forth. Usually it was the 4th, 5th, or 6th grade. And I would have a blackboard, and I'd ask the kids, and we'd make up a book, so to speak, in that. And once afterwards, sometimes I'd meet with parents, and one fellow came up and he said, "You could do a lot if you do a Christian one," And I thought, well, I don't want to get into that kind of moralizing where everything is all set out and follows a particular prescription for what's good. That's not kind of book I would want to write.
Well, there you go. There's 2 lessons for storytelling: no New York City visits, and no religious moralizing.
Well, I would have done the New York City one, but I would go for that, but not the religious moralizing. No.
Well, like I said at the top, I think that a lot of screenwriters, certainly of my generation, Gen X, looked to your books as inspiration for future storytelling attempts. I know I did. I will say selfishly that my favorite was Who Killed Harlow Thrombey, the murder mystery. It just totally tickled me and titillated and scared me, and it was everything. I loved it, and it reappeared very unexpectedly when Rian Johnson released his movie Knives Out, when the victim was very closely named to Harlow Thrombey.
He was named Harlan Thrombey. Yeah,
Harlan Thrombey.
Harlan Thrombey. Actually, I get letters sometimes from former fans. They're usually about your age, you know.
Right.
I said, you better look at this Knives Out or something. He said, they ripping you off. Well, I saw that movie, and they weren't ripping me off. It had all the very, very slightest generic similarities. But the name Harlan Thrombey definitely sounded like
yes.
You could. I didn't consider it a ripoff. It was just amused me.
I am Alan Stevens, personal lawyer for best-selling mystery novelist Harlan Thrombey. Harlan's will states that a significant part of his fortune be given to his fans.
What? You're a pack of vultures at the feast. Now, feast bloody.
So I want to ask about, once the books really took off, things really must have changed for you very quickly. So I know, first of all, there was a big New York Times article about it, and then you were on the Today Show. Right. What was media celebrity like for a low-key lawyer like yourself?
Well, I wouldn't call it quite media celebrity, because we remember, was it Andy Warhol said everybody has their 15 minutes of fame? Well,
Andy Warhol, yes.
I had my 15 minutes of fame, particularly with the Today Show. And I remember I was walking around Manhattan, and the next day or that afternoon or something, and I saw somebody looking at me with their head turning. Didn't I see you recently? I thought, this must be how it is for a celebrity, with people turning out their heads to stare at you. But that didn't last long.
But certainly the sales. I mean, what kind of sales figures were you getting in those early days?
My first books sold over 1 million copies, and then it began to trickle down rapidly from there. In fact, most people who recall books and say, "Oh, I love this book," or "I love that book," or "I remember this," they're nearly all talking about books in the first 20 books, say, because the series, like anything that gets very popular, it runs into a bell curve where it goes up and then it drifts downward. But for a long time they sold very well, but the first books were the ones that really piled up the big figures.
Did it make you fabulously wealthy?
No, because actually, first of all, I had a lot of people had cuts in my income, and then when I was making the most money, the tax rate was much higher. This is something progressive politicians, like Robert Reich, will remind people that at the beginning of Reagan's era, it was around 50%, and then there was a state tax and so forth. Then there was a lot of I had a lot of expenses with various personal things and kids, and not making very good decisions and so forth. So I never became fabulously wealthy, and I didn't really have much. I couldn't see much difference between being comfortable and fabulously wealthy as far as actual lifestyle was concerned. So I didn't have to worry about money, and that's all I cared about.
So you never had to be a lawyer again once the books took off.
That was a big plus because it was the wrong career for me. I was sleepwalking when I went through my law career, and it was as I only realized much later.
when you write something that sells 1 million copies and it's, beloved by children, it's fantasy and sci-fi, I assume Hollywood comes calling at some point. Did they?
Because it was interactive, Hollywood wasn't set up to do interactive movies. And what interactive movies they've done, as far as I know, haven't been tremendous hits.
But they've turned things like Slinkies and they've turned toys into movies. So I would think maybe they could turn one of your books into a movie.
Well, they could have done. They would have been. They should have, but they didn't. I actually wrote some other book series after I got writing all kinds of things. And one of the series I wrote, which didn't go over very well, was called ESP McGee. And it was about a boy detective named ESP McGee. And like Sherlock Holmes and so many other movies, I was a big fan of Nero Wolfe books. And Nero Wolfe had an assistant named Archie Goodwin. And it was like Watson for Holmes. And so I had a kid who was ESP McGee's buddy, and he narrated this. And the idea was that he solved mysteries, and you never could tell whether he did it by ESP or not. But anyway, that actually got optioned by Paramount, and they renewed it twice. But they didn't go ahead with to make a movie out of it. That was my only experience with Hollywood.
And then what about with the rise of video games? Did you have interactive narrative people reaching out? Or
after the series ended, it wasn't. I didn't have anything going while I was writing the books. But by the time the series ended, and my former fans became producers and game producers, and they were at that point I got approached by several, and a guy they were published in Spanish and were very popular in Spanish. The guy in Chile made something that was like it was sort of an animation kind of thing. I can't even explain it, but I had that. And these guys, they really put a lot into it, and they did good product, but they had trouble really making it work economically. I had a guy in Spain in Barcelona who really put a lot of time and money and talent into making a text-based computer game based on one of my escape books. This is a book where you're marooned on an island of a distant planet, and you have to try to escape from it. And we got very far in that, but he taught computer science at the University of Barcelona. He had a couple of kids, and he just ran out of time and money to pursue it. And then I had a guy in Amsterdam, the Netherlands, and he approached me a few years ago, and we made something for Alexa, Amazon's Alexa, called one of my books called Journey to the Year 3000. And I had another guy who did something. So I've had three or four or five projects of this sort. And particularly the one based on Escape, I thought was terrifically had terrific potential, but it was somebody trying to do it in their spare time and without limited capital and resources, and didn't have the marketing tie-in, and so they didn't. Nobody hit the sweet spot as far as marketing went with any of these, and so they weren't remunerative, but they were very interesting. I established some very satisfying relationships with people from different countries.
Yeah, I think a lot of our listeners are probably too young to remember this, but the first video games were text-based interactive video games like Zork and Oregon Trail, and they were very similar to a Choose Your Own Adventure book, just they would appear on your early Apple computer.
Yeah,
in
yeah.
text form.
I didn't follow that whole scene very much. I only got involved in it to the extent somebody approached me, but I liked what they were trying to do.
Now, I have to imagine with such a successful and innovative product, you've had your share of imitators over the years. And I remember one called Which Way Books. Do you remember these knockoffs?
That was a subsidiary of pocketbooks titled Archway Publishing. They published paperback books for kids, and so they couldn't use Choose Your Own Adventure because Bantam had the trademark. So they had to think up another trademark, and they thought up Which Way. And actually, Sugarcane Island which was still controlled by the small press, Vermont Crossroads Press. Before the Bantam deal, they made a deal with while I was doing Lippincott, they made a deal with Archway to put out Sugarcane as a Which Way book, and I think it appeared as a Which Way book briefly, but once Bantam came forward and with this powerhouse marketing, the Which Way, which may have put out a couple of other book titles besides Sugarcane, faded, and Bantam gobbled up the rights to not only the Lippincott books that I had written, but also the Which Way, when Sugarcane Island was eventually reissued by Bantam as part of the Choose Your Own Adventure series. And because the original Sugarcane Island, which was published by Vermont Crossroads Press, and briefly by Which Way, as I remember, it was a little bit short for to fit in with the series. So I had to write some extra material for Bantam's edition of Sugarcane Island. So Which Way was one of the others, one of the series. A guy I knew, a book packager, put out a series called Time Machine, which was the same, but all time travel books, but following the Choose Your Own Adventure format. And there were some other imitators also copying the same format, but with the same trademark. And because when Choose Your Own Adventure series, after it went out of print, out of production in the late 1990s, Random House by then had owned Bantam, and they abandoned the trademark, and Ray Montgomery, the former small press publisher, picked up the trademark and started his own company called ChooseCo, and ChooseCo continues to release these books in this format under the Choose Your Own Adventure trademark, which they own, and I'm totally out of the picture in that regard. Some years ago, maybe around 2012 or 13, my agent, who became Amy Burkow at Writers House, got a contract for me with Simon & Schuster. We put out 3 of my favorite books in expanded, revised editions, but I couldn't use the Choose Your Own Adventure trademark, so we invented the trademark U Ventures. And these books are very good, but because they didn't have the Choose Your Own Adventure trademark, they didn't get much attention, and that they were all out of print.
So now, if I wanted to purchase the original run, like the classic ones, like Cave of Time and Who Killed Harlow Thrombey, Deadwood City, are those available?
Yeah, you'd really have to get them from used book dealers, or you can get them. Most titles are available from used book dealers through Amazon or Powell's in Portland, Oregon, this big, tremendous bookstore in Portland.
But they are not currently in print. You can't get new
No,
versions.
you cannot get new copies unless you get one that's been preserved, as a vintage. Some people collect them, and
Yeah, what is a first edition Cave of Time worth? Mint condition.
really don't know. I haven't followed it, but I've told my kids and grandkids that have copies of these books to keep them very, very careful. Like the first edition of Sugarcane Island, I imagine if not already, will someday be quite a collector's item and valuable. But I haven't checked up on that.
Yeah, I was buying these books alongside my Return of the Jedi action figures, and had I only saved those, but they've all been lost to the sands of time.
Yeah, I had I have quite a few things that I wish I hadn't thrown out, such as the 1939 Spencer Fireworks catalog. In those days, my brother and I were able to order fireworks from Spencer's Fireworks Company in Polk, Ohio, and have them shipped Railway Express. And so the Spencer Fireworks catalog was one of the great publications of all time. They had fireworks. I'm sure that they go, copies in good condition, I'm sure, go for a lot of money.
That would make a good demise in a Choose Your Own Adventure book. You get blown up by Spencer Fireworks. Glug, glug, glug. But I just talking about the imitators, much more recently, Netflix had their interactive episode of Black Mirror, Bandersnatch, which works exactly like a Choose Your Own Adventure. You watch a scene, and then you're given an option of which choice you want to make, and then that determines which scene comes next until you reach a conclusion.
We're going to be a hit factory, like Motown, but for computer games. You heard it here first.
Bandersnatch. It's an adventure game based on the book. Jerome F. Davies was a genius.
See that bloke who went cuckoo and cut his wife's head off?
When it's a concept piece, bit of madness is what you need.
Now, I understand that led to a lawsuit. Were you involved in that lawsuit?
Oh, no, because that lawsuit was brought by Chusco, which, as I mentioned, acquired the trademark Choose Your Own Adventure, and they have zealously protected it. So I'm not involved with that at all.
Did you experience Bandersnatch at all? I'm wondering what you thought of it.
I didn't watch it. I'm just involved in other things than really at this point. I've been working on a science fiction novel, and so my whole emotional psychic energy is going into other things besides.
You have better things to do than to watch Bandersnatch. But it was Hollywood's biggest hat tip to what you created, certainly, and it was a big success. So it was really nice to see it, even though maybe your former partners were not too thrilled with the creative liberties taken. I have to ask, what's your favorite Choose Your Own Adventure, whether it's a single book or a choice you gave or a death? Like, do you have a personal favorite?
Well, I think it's affected by letters I've gotten from former fans and what they've liked and so forth, and I think my two favorites have become those. One is the Inside UFO 5440, which has become quite famous within certain circles because it was a space thing, and you in the course of the book you learn about a planet Ultima, which is just everything. It's just terrific there. It's just like paradise, everything you'd want. And so, how do you get there? But as the warning page at the beginning of the book tells you, you can't get there the ordinary way. It's not that easy. And it turns out that there's no choice that leads to Ultima. It's just a page in the book that certain page about 85, or maybe it's 92, or I don't know, where Ultima, you've arrived there. So you only get to Ultima by not following the choices, not doing what you normally do. And if you just tried every choice that's given in the book, you wouldn't get to Ultima. So that I even got a letter from somebody saying that a Zen monk had described this as a very Buddhist kind of situation, that you can't get there by trying to get there. So
I love that.
And that I think that was good. And then there's another book I wrote I've gotten a lot of mail about, which is Hyperspace, which is a book in which I try to have everything as weird as possible, and extra dimensions and so forth. And in that book, I actually appear as a character in the book, and you, the reader, are in a bad situation, but here I come along, and you, the reader, feel, oh boy, I've got the author of the story. He can help me. I can get out of this situation. But unfortunately, I fell through a crack into the extra dimension, and so I wasn't able to help. But anyway, I like this idea of having something that's really surprising in a way beyond just a plot point.
Well, I love both those examples. The first one, Ultima, is a great metaphor for what you've done. You did not play by the rules, and you produced something absolutely like Valhalla, to me at least. And the second one, it just reminded me of how much you played with reality and creativity, and you were my first, I think, approach or brush with mind expansion. You went there, and you opened my mind, and it totally changed the way I perceive art and creativity and narrative. So I just want to thank you personally. It's a thrill to be able to do that face to face.
Well, thank you. It's a thrill for me to talk to you and hear these good things.
And so you're still writing. How old are you now?
91.
Unbelievable. You look much younger than 91.
Well, I've told people there's 3 things you got to do. One is eat right, exercise right, and be lucky. So unfortunately, you can't control the last one, but so far I've had it. And so another thing is I read recently that when for old people it's good to stimulate your mind in different ways, and they gave a list of ways that you keep your mind stimulated. And one is reading novels, because you have to keep track of all the characters and development and so forth. And I thought it's even better for your mind if you write a novel, because it's even more demanding. And so I found that to be true.
Well put. I'm going to head out and do some exercise, and maybe not write a novel, but maybe read one, or maybe even a choose your own adventure.
I hope you're lucky too.
Yes, I hope I'm lucky too. Well, thank you so much, Mr. Packard, Edward Packard, the creator, the genius behind the Choose Your Own Adventure series. Such a thrill to have you on It Happened in Hollywood.
Many thanks.
Wow, what an exciting moment for me to be able to have actually interviewed Edward Packard. That was sort of a childhood dream come true. And how amazing that he took something as traditional and immutable as a book and turned it into a game for kids. I just really admire him. And I love how creative he's remained even in his 90s. So thank you, Edward Packard, for giving us the world Choose Your Own Adventure books. Next week, we'll be back to movies. So no more reading, even the Choose Your Own Adventure kind. What we're going to do is have an actor who's long been one of my favorites. His name is Griffin Dunne, and you probably know him from American Werewolf in London, and also this incredible film from Martin Scorsese. Probably not the genre you associate with him. There are no gangsters anywhere. This is not a historic epic. This was a small comedy he made when Last Temptation of Christ fell through the first time. And he found himself needing a project. After Hours is 1985. It also stars Rosanna Arquette, who, if you'll recall, was also the star of Desperately Seeking Susan, I believe from the same year. This was a real breakout year for her. And it's just delicious movie set in Soho in New York before Soho gentrified, where it was full of all kinds of after hours weirdos and this one kind of hapless everyman who finds himself unable to get home. So if you've not seen After Hours, I believe it's on Showtime. Check it out. It's one of Scorsese's unsung gems of a film. It's very, very funny. And next week, we'll have Griffin Dunn here to tell us everything about the making of that awesome comedy. And until then, I'll see you in Hollywood.